The heavy tactical vest felt like a lead weight against my chest, but the only thing I could focus on was the quiet, terrifying intensity in the eyes of the man cleaning a shallow cut on my jaw. Before I get deeper into this absolute mess of a situation, do me a huge favor and drop a comment right now telling me what city or country you are listening from. It is always amazing to see where you all are tuning in from. All right, back to the night my entire life turned upside down. I started noticing Hayes during my third month working in the organized crime control unit. Not because he was loud or overly friendly. Honestly, it was the exact opposite. He barely talked to anyone unless it was strictly necessary. I am an operative, which means my job is usually chaotic, unpredictable, and running on a mixture of adrenaline and pure caffeine. We spend our days chasing ghosts, sitting in unmarked vans, and kicking in doors when the warrants finally come through. It is an ugly, noisy job. But Hayes was different. He was the tactical paramedic assigned to our specific task force, the guy who patched us up when things went sideways. Every night, around the time my squad dragged ourselves back into the precinct to file paperwork, he would appear near the entrance of the tactical bay. He would just stand there, hands resting behind his back, his dark blue medical uniform perfectly straight, expression completely unreadable, while the rest of us threw our gear into lockers and complained about the brass. At first, I assumed he was just waiting on an inventory drop or doing routine checks, but then I noticed the pattern. He only lingered around the bay when my team was returning, and somehow, no matter how late a sting operation kept us out, he was always there when I finally walked out of the debrief room. His radio name tag just said Hayes. That was it. No outgoing personality, no random precinct small talk. Just Hayes. Tall, broad-shouldered, and carrying himself in this deeply grounded, quiet way that made every other cop in the building seem entirely too loud. "Our department medic has a massive crush on you," my partner Ramirez whispered one night while we were unloading our weapons at the clearing barrel. I snorted, nearly fumbling my magazine. "He is literally just doing his job," I muttered back. "He barely even speaks to me." "That is exactly the point," Ramirez said, shaking her head. "Men like that are terrifying when they actually like someone." I rolled my eyes, but the stupid comment stayed in my head much longer than I wanted it to, mainly because she was not entirely wrong. Hayes watched a lot more than he talked. It was never in a creepy way, nothing that made my skin crawl. It was just this heavy, attentive presence. It was like he always noticed when my hands were shaking from an adrenaline crash, or when the unit commander was breathing down my neck, or when I skipped my mandatory meal break because the surveillance logs were piling up. One Thursday night, about 10 minutes before the end of a grueling 14-hour shift, an angry informant we had brought in started screaming at me in the middle of the squad room over a protective custody deal I had absolutely no control over. I was already completely exhausted. My shift had started before the sun came up, my squad leader was caught up in court, and my patience was thinner than a wire. "I gave you the location 3 weeks ago," the informant snapped, slamming his hands down on my desk. "You people are unbelievable." "I understand your frustration," I said carefully, forcing my voice to remain perfectly level even though my head was pounding. "But department policy only allows us to process the safe house request once the prosecutor signs off." "I do not care about your policy," he yelled, stepping closer in a way that made my instincts flare up. Before I could even stand up to handle the situation, a calm, impossibly steady voice appeared right beside him. "Is there a problem here?" It was Hayes. The informant turned around immediately, his whole aggressive posture deflating the second he saw the size of the man standing there and the absolute ice in his expression. Hayes did not even look angry, he just looked immovable. The guy muttered something bitter under his breath, grabbed his jacket, and stormed out of the precinct without another word. A heavy silence settled over my desk afterward. I exhaled slowly, rubbing my temples. Thanks. Hayes nodded once. You okay? Yeah, I laughed tiredly, leaning back in my chair. Occupational hazard. His eyes stayed on my face just a second too long. You look completely exhausted, he said quietly. Something about the low timbre of his voice made my chest tighten in a way that caught me off guard. It was not flirtatious. It was not performative. It was just intensely observant. It has been a really long week, I admitted. He glanced around the nearly empty squad room, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. What time do you log out? In like 15 minutes. He nodded again. I will walk you to your car. It was not a question, and weirdly enough, I found myself not minding at all. Outside the precinct, the secure motor pool was mostly empty. The damp, cold city air settled over the concrete, while a few patrol officers filtered toward their personal vehicles in small groups. I shoved my hands deep into my jacket pockets as we walked, the silence between us feeling surprisingly comfortable. Do you always do this? I asked, looking up at him. Do what? Escort random undercover operatives into the night? The corner of his mouth twitched slightly. It was the absolute first time I had seen anything resembling a smile from him. Only the ones that look half dead by the end of watch, he replied. I laughed quietly, the sound echoing lightly in the empty lot. We reached my beaten-up sedan, and for a second, neither of us moved. Up close, under the pale streetlights, he looked older than me at first glance, but probably not by much. Maybe in his early 30s. He had these tired, deep-set eyes and a strong jawline. It was the kind of face that looked dead serious even when he was completely relaxed. Well, I said awkwardly, shifting my weight. Thanks again for dealing with that guy. No problem, Nolan. The way he said my name sent a sudden jolt straight through my nervous system. I had never actually introduced myself to him. You know my name? His expression did not change at all. It is painted in bold white letters on your tactical locker. Right, I said, feeling incredibly stupid. Obviously. Still, I could feel my face warming up anyway. He stepped back slightly, his hands returning behind his back like he suddenly remembered he was on duty and supposed to act like a professional medic. Drive safe. And then he just turned and walked away. I sat in my car much longer than necessary afterward, the engine idling while I watched him disappear back through the heavy steel doors of the precinct. Ramirez's stupid comment echoed loudly in my head the entire drive back to my empty apartment. The medic has a massive crush on you. I told myself she was completely wrong, but the very next night, Hayes was waiting by the armory doors again. The dangerous thing about Hayes was that once I started really noticing him, I found it impossible to stop. It just became part of my daily routine in the chaotic world of organized crime control. Around 11 at night, he would appear somewhere near the equipment cages, pretending to check trauma kits or organize medical supplies while I finished logging my undercover recordings. Then, once my shift officially ended, he would walk me out to the motor pool like it was the most normal thing in the world. There was no obvious flirting, no overt moves, just this quiet, unshakable consistency. And somehow, that was infinitely worse for my sanity. You are smiling at the trauma medic again, Ramirez whispered the following Tuesday while we were calibrating our radios in the gear room. I am absolutely not, I shot back instantly. You literally are. I immediately forced my face into a completely neutral expression. I do not even know the guy. You know enough, she hummed, walking away. I ignored her completely, but later that night, while locking my sidearm in the secure safe, I caught Hayes already standing near the hallway entrance, just watching me. The precinct lights had dimmed for the night shift, leaving the corridor washed in shadows. Do you always stare like that? I asked before my brain could stop my mouth. His eyebrows lifted just a fraction of an inch. Like what? Like you are actively analyzing a hostile crime scene. That almost smile appeared on his face again. I am observant. Sounds pretty ominous, I said. It is the nature of the job. I shook my head, fighting very hard not to grin back. The most dangerous thing about Hayes was not that he was physically intimidating, it was that he was so relentlessly calm. Around him, everything inside my usually frantic brain slowed down in a way I had never experienced before. Most guys in my line of work felt loud, volatile, constantly performing their masculinity. Hayes felt steady. It was a grounded steadiness that should have made him fade into the background. Instead, it made me think about him constantly. That same night, after we finally left the building, a freezing rain started pouring down out of nowhere halfway across the motor pool lot. Seriously, I groaned, pulling my collar up around my neck to block the chill. Hayes immediately stepped closer, taking his heavy uniform jacket off and holding it over both of our heads without saying a single word. My heart did something incredibly embarrassing in my chest. You really do not have to do that, I said, my voice sounding a little tighter than usual. You are going to get sick. So will you, he replied calmly. I will survive a little water. We hurried the rest of the way to my car, both of us getting pretty soaked regardless. I was completely laughing by the time we reached my door, cold rain dripping heavily from my hair. Hayes looked down at me for a long, quiet second, and suddenly the atmosphere shifted. It was not dramatic, just enough to make the damp air between us feel incredibly heavy. Are you always this happy after terrible shifts? He asked quietly. I think I am just severely sleep deprived at this point, I answered. That explains a whole lot. I laughed again, but much softer this time. He was standing so close to me now that I could clearly see tiny raindrops caught in his eyelashes. Neither of us made a move to step back. The rain hit the roof of my car in a loud, rhythmic drumming. Then his shoulder radio crackled loudly with dispatch traffic. The fragile moment snapped instantly. Hayes took a half step back, pressing the transmit button purely on muscle memory. Copy that, he said into the mic. Right. Department medic. Professional. Completely normal. He lowered his hand, his expression returning to that unreadable mask. You should head home and get some sleep. The disappointment I felt washing over me was immediate and completely irrational. Yeah, I said, fumbling for my keys. Right. I opened my car door, but before sliding in, I looked back at him standing in the downpour. You know, I said over the noise of the rain, most people just say a quick goodbye at the exit and leave. I know, he replied, but you keep waiting for me to walk with you. For the absolute first time since I had met this man, Hayes actually looked genuinely caught off guard. His stoic mask slipped. The rain continued to hit the pavement around us in steady waves. Finally, he shifted his weight and said very quietly, I like knowing you get to your car safe. My chest tightened so hard it almost physically hurt. Because in our line of work, there were 100 safer, more casual answers he could have chosen. That was not one of them. I swallowed hard against the lump in my throat. Good night, Hayes. Good night, Nolan. I drove back to my apartment smiling like a complete idiot, and my situation only got more complicated after that. The next couple of weeks blurred into something dangerously close to a domestic routine that neither of us was willing to acknowledge out loud. Our shifts were chaotic, violent, and draining, but the quiet moments became everything. He started bringing me coffee during the agonizingly slow late-night stakeout briefings. Black for himself, heavily sugared with extra cream for me. How do you even know my coffee order? I asked the first time he slid the styrofoam cup across the briefing table. You literally press the exact same buttons on the terrible break room machine every single day, he said smoothly. Again with the relentless observing. You are acting kind of creepy, do you know that? You still drank the coffee, he pointed out. Fair point. One evening, after an especially brutal raid that left my squad completely exhausted, Hayes and I ended up sitting side by side on the floor of the deserted evidence hallway while I ate a crushed protein bar because I had missed dinner again. Hayes sat with his back against the cold concrete wall, his radio turned down low for once. Do you ever actually sleep? He asked, watching me tear the wrapper. Rarely, I mumbled. That is highly unhealthy. So is being a trauma medic for a specialized police unit. That actually earned a real, genuine laugh from him. It was not loud, but it was deep and real. And, honestly, I think that might have been the exact second I realized I was completely and utterly screwed. Because seeing Hayes smile felt like witnessing something secret that nobody else in the world was allowed to see. Do you hate this assignment? He asked after a long minute of comfortable silence. I shrugged, chewing thoughtfully. I do not hate it. I just never thought I would still be kicking indoors and writing surveillance reports at 28. He looked at me very carefully. You think you are falling behind in life? Sometimes. Hayes was quiet for a long moment before saying softly, most people in this building are faking having their lives together. Does that include you? I asked. He looked down the dark, empty corridor. Especially me. That genuinely surprised me. Hayes always seemed so perfectly composed, so thoroughly in control of every situation. What is your story, then? I asked, keeping my voice soft so I would not break the mood. He hesitated long enough that I almost thought he was going to ignore the question entirely. Then he sighed. Ex-military, combat medic. I did not really know what the hell came after that, so I ended up here. I blinked, processing that. Seriously? He nodded once. Suddenly, so many things about him made perfect sense. The rigid posture, the extreme situational awareness, the constant, silent scanning of every room he entered like he could not turn off the threat assessment. Is that adjustment hard? I asked carefully. His jaw tightened just a fraction. Some days are worse than others. The raw honesty in his voice completely caught me off guard. Most men in our department tried so incredibly hard to sound invincible all the time. They masked their trauma with dark humor and aggression. Hayes never did that. A sudden draft from the ventilation system swept through the hallway, dropping the temperature. Without thinking, I rubbed my hands up and down my arms. Immediately, his eyes tracked the movement. You are freezing. I am perfectly fine, I lied. You are visibly shivering. I am just being dramatic. He stared at me for half a second before quietly unzipping his heavy uniform fleece and holding it out toward me. I laughed softly. Again with the jacket? Just take it, Nolan. The low, gravelly way he said my name should honestly be a federal crime. I slid the dark fleece on before my common sense could stop me. It smelled strongly of sterile alcohol wipes, rain, and exactly like Hayes, which definitely did not help the massive crush I was developing. He watched me settle into the oversized fabric, his expression visibly softening. Better? Little bit. Silence settled between us again. It was a deeply comfortable silence, a dangerous silence. Then my phone buzzed violently against the concrete floor. It was a text from Ramirez. Are you having a romantic moment with the medic in the evidence hall right now? I nearly choked on my protein bar. "What is it?" Hayes asked instantly, going on alert. "Nothing. You look extremely guilty. I am being actively cyberbullied by my partner." That tiny smile appeared on his lips again, and suddenly I had the overwhelming, terrifying feeling that whatever was growing between us was getting much too large to pretend it was not there anymore. Things finally became impossible to ignore the night Hayes got jealous. It was not a loud, dramatic jealousy. It was not aggressive or possessive. It was just a quiet, vibrating tension that made my stomach flip upside down. It happened during a massive joint task force meeting on a Friday night. We were working with federal agents, and the precinct was packed. There were suits everywhere, everyone was irritated, and the air conditioning was failing. Around 10 at night, this slick FBI liaison started hanging around the surveillance monitoring desk while I was trying to sort through audio logs. He was tall, overly confident, and definitely trying to flirt while pretending to talk shop. "So," he said smoothly, leaning his hip against the edge of my desk, "does your unit always force you to work these insane hours?" Unfortunately, yes, I told him without looking up from my screen. It should probably violate labor laws. He laughed, a practiced, easy sound. "Do you have any plans after this debrief wraps up?" I hesitated just a fraction of a second, just enough for him to notice the opening. "Maybe," I said carefully. Before the agent could press further, a deeply familiar, icy voice cut in from right beside my chair. "Nolan." It was Hayes. I spun my chair around immediately, and wow, something about his expression was severely off. He was composed, obviously. Hayes was always composed, but there was a coiled tension sitting just beneath the surface of his skin that had not been there 10 minutes ago. "I need you in the medical bay for a routine evaluation," he said, his voice completely flat. The FBI agent glanced between us, slightly confused. "Oh, my bad. Am I interrupting?" Hayes just gave him a single, rigid nod without actually looking at him. The very second the federal agent walked away, I crossed my arms over my chest and stared up at him. "You absolutely do not need me for a routine evaluation." "No, I do not." I stared at him. He stared back. And then, unbelievably, Hayes looked faintly annoyed with his own behavior. "Was I that obvious?" I asked slowly, a smile fighting to break out. He exhaled sharply through his nose. "Probably." I tried my hardest not to smile. I failed immediately. "Are you jealous, Doc?" His jaw tightened visibly. "That federal suit was aggressively hitting on you." "So what?" His eyes finally locked onto mine completely, and the raw, unshielded intensity there nearly wrecked my composure on the spot. "So, I did not like it." The honesty hit me like a physical blow to the chest. There were no games with him, no backpedaling, no defensive denial, just the absolute truth. For a long second, neither of us dared to speak over the hum of the computers. Then I quietly asked, "Why?" Hayes looked away first, his eyes scanning the chaotic squad room like he suddenly regretted saying the words out loud. But when he finally answered, his voice was incredibly low and careful. "You know exactly why." Yeah, I really did. My heart started beating so fast it was actually becoming annoying, because this unnameable thing between us had existed in quiet fragments for months now. The long looks across the armory, the coffee runs, the hushed late-night conversations, him waiting for me after every single dangerous raid. But hearing it acknowledged out loud, even indirectly, made it a reality in a completely terrifying way. "Hayes," I started softly, wanting to close the distance. His radio crackled loudly with a dispatch code for a medical assist in holding. Of course it did. The universe had terrible timing. He pressed the button automatically, his eyes never leaving my face. "Copy. En route." The fragile bubble shattered. Again, a flicker of genuine frustration crossed his features. "I have to go to Holding," he muttered. "Yeah, I know." He nodded once, but before turning away to leave, he stepped closer, just a few inches, close enough that my breath caught in my throat. "Do not leave the building without me tonight," he commanded quietly. Then he turned and walked off down the crowded corridor before I could even formulate an answer. I spent the next 2 hours completely incapable of functioning as a normal operative. Ramirez noticed almost instantly when I accidentally filed the same surveillance log 3 times in a row. "Oh my God," she whispered aggressively, leaning over my desk. "What exactly happened?" "Nothing happened. You look like someone just proposed to you." I rubbed both hands forcefully over my face. Hayes intimidated a federal agent with his aura. "Excuse me?" He was jealous. Her jaw literally dropped open. "I knew it. Please lower your voice before my career implodes." She grabbed my arm dramatically. "Nolan, the terrifying tactical medic, is deeply in love with you." "He is not." "You are right. Emotionally unavailable combat medics totally escort their coworkers to the parking lot every night just for the exercise." I hated how much sense she made. The rest of the shift dragged on painfully. Every time the heavy doors to the squad room swung open, I jumped in my seat. Every time someone walked past my desk, I looked up hoping to see dark blue scrubs. It was deeply pathetic behavior for a trained operative. Finally, just after 1 in the morning, he appeared again. But immediately, I knew something had shifted. His expression looked tense in a completely different way now. It was sharper, more distant. "You ready?" he asked stiffly. "Yeah." We walked through the silent, dimly lit motor pool in complete silence for a long time, before I finally stopped walking right beside the bumper of my car. "What happened?" Hayes frowned slightly, not looking at me. "What do you mean? You completely disappeared for hours." "I was working." "No," I said quietly, stepping into his line of sight. "Now you are actively avoiding me." That made him go completely still. A freezing wind swept across the asphalt, carrying the distant wail of police sirens from the city streets. Finally, Hayes let out a long, heavy sigh. "I should not have said what I said earlier." My stomach dropped violently. Oh, it was incredibly unprofessional. Professional. Right. For some reason, hearing him use that word hurt far more than it should have. I looked down at my worn-out boots, forcing myself to nod like it did not bother me at all. "Okay, Nolan." "No, it is totally fine," I interrupted quickly, grabbing my keys. "You do not owe me anything." The absolute second the words left my mouth, I regretted them, because his expression changed instantly. It shattered. It looked like I had genuinely inflicted physical pain on him. "That is not what I meant." "Then what the hell did you mean?" Silence. A long, agonizing silence. Then, speaking so quietly I almost could not hear him over the wind, "I am just trying to do this right." I looked up slowly. Hayes stepped closer. He stepped close enough that I could see the bone-deep exhaustion hiding behind his eyes. "When I left the military," he said carefully, every word sounding measured, "I got exceptionally good at keeping everyone at a safe distance." I did not say anything. And then you happened. My heartbeat stuttered painfully in my chest. He looked deeply frustrated with his own mind, like this level of honesty was physically costing him. "I wait around for your squad to get back because I desperately want to," he admitted, his voice rough. "I notice every little thing about you because I literally cannot stop myself. And when that suit was flirting with you tonight, I absolutely hated how much it bothered me. I completely forgot how to breathe for a solid 5 seconds." Hayes glanced away into the dark lot before continuing. "But you work dangerous operations here. and I am the medic responsible for keeping you alive. So I am trying very hard not to make this complicated or unfair for you." There it was. It was not a rejection. It was fear. It was careful, tightly controlled fear. And somehow, knowing he was terrified of ruining things felt infinitely more dangerous than a rejection. "Hayes," I said softly, stepping closer, "you know this is not one-sided, right?" His eyes snapped back to mine immediately. The naked longing on his face nearly destroyed me. "You should not say things like that unless you completely mean them." "I mean them." The silence crashed back down over us. Then Hayes let out a breath that was almost a laugh, totally disbelieving. "Jesus Christ, Nolan." And before I could even process what was happening, he reached out so carefully, like he was giving me every possible chance to pull away, and brushed his rough fingers lightly against my wrist. It was barely contact, but the heat of it felt enormous. "You really should go home," he said quietly. "You keep telling me to leave." "That is because if you stand here any longer, I am probably going to lose my mind and kiss you in the middle of this parking lot." My brain completely stopped functioning. Every thought was wiped clean. Hayes looked equally shocked by his own confession, which honestly helped my ego a little bit. I stared up at him. He stared intensely back down at me. Then I managed, with absolute brilliance, "Oh." That single word finally made him smile for real. It was a warm, genuine, incredibly dangerous smile. "Yeah," he murmured softly. "Oh." After that night in the freezing motor pool, absolutely everything changed. And somehow, nothing changed at all. Hayes still waited for my squad to return, still brought me terrible coffee, still looked at me like he was using every ounce of his willpower not to cross the line. But now there was a heavy electric undercurrent beneath every single interaction. We were completely aware of each other. The major problem was that once you know for a fact that someone desperately wants to kiss you, every tiny incidental contact becomes absolute torture. The way his hand would brush against my lower back when guiding me through a crowded crime scene. The way his voice dropped an entire octave whenever we were alone in the evidence room. The way his eyes tracked down to my mouth before he forced himself to look away. It was driving me completely insane. "The two of you are actually painful to observe," Ramirez announced 3 days later while we were sitting in the unmarked surveillance van. I looked away from the binoculars innocently. "What does that mean?" "It means the unresolved sexual tension in this van is becoming a hostile work environment." I nearly dropped the heavy optics. "Ramirez." "What?" "He literally watches you like you are the only person left on Earth." "He does not." Right on cue, the heavy side door of the van slid open, and Hayes stood there holding 2 thermal cups of coffee, looking directly at me. Ramirez pointed aggressively at him. That. That exact look right there. Unfortunately, she was 100% correct. The second Hayes realized I was looking back at him, the hard lines of his face softened automatically. It was a microscopic change, barely visible to anyone who did not know him, but once you saw it, it was blinding. "Oh my God," she whispered in horror. "You are both completely doomed." Probably, I thought. Later that week, things escalated. I had taken a minor hit during a breach, just a glancing blow from a suspect that sent me crashing into a drywall corner. I thought I was fine, but my shoulder was bleeding through my tactical shirt. When we got back to the precinct, Hayes pulled me into the sterile, bright medical bay and locked the door behind us. "Sit," he ordered, his voice tight. I sat on the metal exam table, suddenly feeling very small under his gaze. He moved efficiently, cutting the ruined fabric away and cleaning the wound. His hands were incredibly gentle, but his jaw was clenched tight enough to crack teeth. "You are angry," I observed quietly. "I am not angry," he replied, not looking up. "You look furious." He paused, the alcohol wipe hovering over my skin. "I do not like seeing you bleed, Nolan. That is my job. It happens. It should not happen." He finally looked up, and the proximity between us was suddenly overwhelming. He was standing directly between my knees. I could feel the heat radiating off his chest. We were completely alone. The precinct noise outside the heavy door faded away into nothing. "You need to be more careful," he whispered. "Or what?" I challenged softly. His eyes darkened. Before he could stop himself, his hand slid up from my injured shoulder to cup the back of my neck. His thumb stroked the sensitive skin just below my hairline. A shiver wrecked my entire body. "I am trying so hard to be good," he murmured, his face inches from mine. "Then stop trying." He closed his eyes, inhaling sharply. We did not kiss then. The radio interrupted us, as it always did. But the dam was breaking. That Thursday night, we left the precinct later than usual because incident reports had taken forever to file. Most of the detective cars were already gone, leaving the lot almost completely abandoned. A heavy fog had rolled in from the river, wrapping around us as we walked. "Do you ever regret taking this assignment?" I asked suddenly, my breath fogging in the cold air. Hayes glanced over at me. "The tactical unit? Yeah." He considered it for a long second, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Sometimes." "Why is that?" Another quiet pause. "I needed rigid structure after the military," he admitted slowly. "Somewhere predictable, where the rules were clear." That sounds incredibly depressing when you say it out loud like that. It kind of is. I smiled faintly. Then Hayes stopped walking, forcing me to stop too. He looked down at me and added quietly, "But it got significantly less depressing the day you transferred into the unit." My heart genuinely malfunctioned in my chest. You cannot just say things like that casually. I was not being casual in the slightest. Great. Fantastic. I was actively dying. We reached my car, but neither of us made any move to end the conversation or say goodnight. It kept happening like this, like both of us were desperately searching for any excuse to steal another 5 minutes together in the dark. "Do you know what your main problem is?" I asked softly, stepping into his space. Hayes leaned lightly against the side of my car. "Should I be worried?" "You overthink absolutely everything." "That is rich coming from you." "I am completely serious." He looked at me carefully, the fog swirling around his boots. "Explain." I took a deep breath, the cold air burning my lungs. "You keep treating whatever this is like it is something incredibly dangerous." His jaw shifted slightly in the pale light. "Is it not?" "No," I said immediately, shaking my head. "It is just new." A heavy silence settled between us, muffled by the fog. Then Hayes asked quietly, "Are you really not scared of this at all?" I looked at him with absolute honesty. "I think I would be terrified if it was literally anyone else." Something raw and vulnerable flickered across his face so quickly I almost missed it. And suddenly, standing there in the cold, I realized something incredibly important. Hayes was not afraid of wanting me. He was terrified of wanting me too much, of losing control in a life where control was his only safety net. That realization settled heavily and warmly in my chest. "You know what I think?" I said softly. "What?" "I think you have spent so much time and energy trying to stay in perfect control that you forgot some things in life are supposed to feel a little messy." Hayes stared at me for a long, agonizing moment. Then he laughed quietly under his breath, shaking his head in defeat. Nolan. What? You have absolutely no idea what you do to my sanity. The way he said it, low, rough, completely exhausted, destroyed any remaining stability I had left. I stepped closer before my brain could overthink the consequences. Hayes immediately went still. He did not back away. He did not move forward. He just watched me carefully, waiting. He was always waiting for me to make the final decision. You know, I murmured, looking up at his mouth, for a guy who threatened to kiss me weeks ago, you are taking a ridiculously long time to follow through. His eyes darkened instantly. The restraint cracked. That was me trying to behave. Your lack of self-control is honestly getting insulting. That finally broke him. Hayes looked down briefly, his jaw tight, before meeting my eyes with a burning intensity. Do you really want to test that theory right here? Every single nerve ending in my body lit up on fire. But before I could answer, a loud police cruiser siren exploded to life somewhere down the street, piercing the quiet fog. I burst out laughing, dropping my head against his chest. Hayes closed his eyes and groaned like the universe had personally offended him. You have the absolute worst timing I have ever seen in my life, I told him, my face pressed against his jacket. I am painfully aware. The siren faded into the distance. Neither of us moved apart. Then, slowly, almost reverently, Hayes reached up and tucked a stray piece of hair behind my ear. It was such a gentle, careful gesture from hands trained for war and trauma, and somehow that affected me more profoundly than anything else. His rough fingers brushed lightly along my temple before falling away. Drive home safe, he said quietly. But there was something distinctly different in his voice now. There was less restraint. There was inevitability. It was like whatever was building between us had finally reached the point of no return. I swallowed hard. Hayes? Yeah? If I kissed you right now, he went completely still. The empty lot felt completely silent. I could actually see the broad expanse of his chest rising and falling as he tried to breathe normally. What happens? I finished softly. His eyes stayed firmly locked on mine. Then, very carefully, he said, I do not think I would ever be able to pretend this is casual anymore. And honestly, that sounded absolutely perfect to me. I grabbed the heavy material of his tactical jacket and kissed him before my brain could interfere. And immediately, Hayes kissed me back like a drowning man finding oxygen. One of his large hands moved instinctively to my waist, pulling me flush against him with this quiet, overwhelming certainty that melted my entire nervous system. It was not rushed. It was not messy. It was warm, deep, careful, and undeniably real. Kissing Hayes felt exactly like everything else about him did. Steady, intentional, and completely impossible to pull away from. When we finally separated, neither of us moved very far. Hayes rested his forehead heavily against mine, his breathing uneven for the first time since I had met him. Well, I whispered into the quiet space between us. That actually made him laugh softly. You are enjoying this way too much, he said. You have been threatening me with unresolved tension for months. I was trying to be a professional. You failed completely. Clearly, I smiled helplessly against his mouth. Hayes looked down at me for another long second before his expression shifted into something incredibly soft, almost disbelieving. You kissed me, he said quietly. You sound genuinely surprised. I am. Why? His hand remained warmly anchored on my waist while he answered. Because usually, people get tired of waiting for me to figure things out. That hit much deeper than he probably intended. I looked at him carefully, studying the lines of his face. Hayes. Yeah? You know I would have waited as long as it took, right? Something incredibly vulnerable flashed across his face so openly this time that it nearly broke my heart. And suddenly, I understood the core truth of him. Hayes was not slow to act because he did not feel enough. He was slow because he felt things so deeply that he had to take them seriously. The fog around us stayed thick, the distant streetlights reflecting off the wet pavement while we just stood there, refusing to step apart. So, I murmured eventually, running my hands over his chest. What happens now? Hayes smiled faintly, brushing his thumb against my cheekbone. We probably stop pretending all of this is accidental. Good plan. And, he added carefully, his voice dropping an octave, I would very much like to take you on an actual date. I stared at him dramatically. Wow, very traditional of you, Doc. Are you complaining? Absolutely not. That small, genuine smile appeared again, softer now, so much easier than before. Like finally crossing that line had allowed him to drop the heavy armor he wore every day. Are you okay? I asked quietly. He exhaled a long breath through his nose. Ask me again when my heart rate recovers. I laughed immediately. Then Hayes looked at me again, really looked at me, and this deep, profound warmth settled into his eyes. Do you know what the worst part is? He asked. What? I have wanted to do exactly that since the first week you transferred to this unit. My jaw literally dropped. Excuse me? You heard me, Hayes. You were wearing that awful gray tactical shirt, he continued calmly, and you were aggressively yelling at a vending machine because it stole your dollar. I stared at him in utter disbelief. You remember what I was wearing? You remember my highly specific coffee order. Fair point. Still, that is borderline insane behavior. So is falling for an operative because he fights with inanimate objects. I smiled so hard my face actually ached, and for the very first time since this chaotic, stressful job brought us together, there was no suffocating tension sitting between us anymore. There was no hesitation. Just me and the quiet trauma medic standing beside my car, smiling at each other like complete idiots in the fog. Finally, Hayes glanced at his heavy dive watch and sighed reluctantly. I really should let you go home and sleep. I grinned immediately, stepping out of his arms. You always say that. Yeah, he murmured, stepping back slowly. The difference is, tonight I am going to think about kissing you for the entire drive back. My heartbeat instantly lost all control again. Oh, I said weakly. That made him laugh for real. It was warm, low, and completely gone for me. Yeah, Nolan, he said softly. Oh. Dating Hayes turned out to be strangely, wonderfully easy. Not because he suddenly became less intense. If anything, his focus got worse. He was just much softer about it in private. Our first official date happened 3 nights later at a tiny, obscure diner way out on the edge of the city limits because, according to Hayes, nobody from the department ever goes there. You are still thinking like a paranoid operative, I teased him while sliding into the cracked vinyl booth across from him. I am adapting, slowly. You escorted me to my car for months before finally kissing me. That was lightning fast for me. I laughed loudly, drawing a look from the tired waitress. God, I loved making him smile. Outside the diner windows, the rain started tapping softly against the glass. Apparently, terrible weather was just part of our relationship aesthetic now. Hayes sat across from me, looking calmer than I had ever seen him in my life. He was not guarded. He was not constantly scanning the exits. He was just fully present. It hit me halfway through a plate of terrible diner fries that this was the absolute first time I had ever been alone with him without the heavy weight of a shift hanging over our heads. There were no radios interrupting us, no squad commanders yelling, no motor pool goodbyes, just pure, uninterrupted time. You are staring at me, Hayes pointed out quietly, resting his arms on the table. You have gotten significantly less scary, I observed. That is deeply disappointing. No, it is worse, actually. His eyebrows lifted. Worse? You are incredibly cute now. Hayes looked personally offended by the word. Cute? Very. I was a combat medic in a war zone, Nolan. And now you know exactly how I take my coffee, and you hold my hand under tables. That completely broke his composure. Hayes laughed hard enough to duck his head briefly, and I swear something rearranged permanently inside my chest, seeing him look so freely happy. Because this version of him felt private. It felt like a privilege. You know, he said once he finally recovered his breath, you are much bolder now that you know for a fact I am obsessed with you. You were very emotionally intimidating at first. Fair. A long, comfortable silence settled over our table after that. It was the good kind of silence, the kind where just looking at each other felt just as natural and necessary as breathing. Then Hayes reached across the table, wrapping his large hand around mine. Can I tell you something without you immediately making fun of me? Probably not, but please continue. He shook his head slightly, smiling under his breath before his expression turned deeply serious. The very first night I walked you to your car in the motor pool, he admitted slowly, his thumb tracing the back of my hand. I sat in my truck in the dark for almost 20 minutes, trying to convince myself not to ask for your phone number. My heart immediately melted into a puddle. You wanted my number that early on? I noticed you the exact day you transferred in. I stared at him. Hayes shrugged faintly, looking almost embarrassed by his own confession. You were helping rack the heavy gear in the armory, and you were singing some terrible pop song under your breath because you thought nobody else was around. You are an awful singer, by the way. Very rude. You still are. I laughed helplessly, but underneath the humor, a profound warmth spread through my entire body, because Hayes noticed absolutely everything. Not just the big dramatic moments, but the tiny insignificant ones too. And suddenly, I understood why his attention had always felt so different, so heavy. It was never just surface level physical attraction. He paid attention because caring deeply came naturally to him. That realization hit me hard enough that I went completely quiet for a long second. Hayes noticed instantly, squeezing my hand. What is it? Nothing. Nolan. I smiled softly, looking down at our joined hands. I just really, really like you. The words slipped out of my mouth before my brain could overthink them. Hayes went completely still immediately. He was not uncomfortable. He was just deeply affected. His dark eyes stayed fixed on my face for several long seconds before he answered, his voice dropping to a rough whisper. You have absolutely no idea what hearing you say that does to me. Yeah, that definitely did not help my rapidly accelerating heartbeat. After dinner, Hayes walked me to my car out of sheer habit, even though we had driven separately to the diner. You do realize I am a highly trained operative capable of surviving a diner parking lot completely alone, right? I pointed out as we walked. I know that, but his hand settled firmly and warmly against my lower back. But I really like taking care of you. I nearly tripped over a completely flat piece of pavement. Hayes caught my arm instantly, trying very hard not to laugh at me. Are you okay there, tough guy? No, I informed him with complete honesty. You say things that cause me severe psychological damage. A warm, brilliant smile spread slowly across his handsome face. Good. The parking lot outside the diner was entirely empty, illuminated only by a few flickering, pale streetlights reflecting the rainwater across the black asphalt. Hayes stopped beside the driver's side door of my car reluctantly. And wow, I was already starting to genuinely hate saying goodbye to him. Are you working the shift tomorrow? I asked softly, turning to face him. He nodded once. Late night rotation. Me too. Something deeply pleased flickered across his expression at the confirmation. We still had our routine, only now I was actually allowed to kiss him at the end of it. Hayes reached up carefully and brushed his thumb lightly along my jawline, tracing the spot where that cut had healed weeks ago. It was a tiny gesture with a massive, earth-shattering effect. Do you know what is really weird? He murmured, stepping into my space. What? I spent months trying incredibly hard not to touch you. His voice dropped even lower, becoming a vibration I could feel in my chest. And now it is literally the only thing I think about. My entire nervous system short-circuited on the spot. Hayes, I breathed. That sounded much less smooth out loud than it did in your head. No, I said weakly, my hands finding his waist. It really did not. He laughed softly, stepping closer again until I could feel the solid heat radiating from his body in the freezing night air. Then he kissed me. It was slow this time, completely unhurried. It was the kiss of a man who finally believed he was allowed to have what he wanted. And standing there in the rain-damp parking lot outside a mediocre diner, kissing the quiet trauma medic who used to wait in the shadows for my shifts to end every night, I realized something that made my chest ache in the absolute best possible way. Hayes had been incredibly careful with me from the very beginning, not because he was unsure of what he wanted, but because I mattered to him long before either of us was brave enough to admit it out loud.